Welcome along to Live on Air this evening. Tonight we're at Crossroads Church in Papakura, and with me is the Reverend Peter Williamson,
David.
long-time colleague, and we were just saying before the broadcast began that we're sitting in the church lounge at Crossroads, and I'm looking out the window. There's the adult sex shop on one corner, there's the brothel on the other corner, and Peter informs me that sometimes the police use the upstairs of this building to gather information. So I'm not quite sure what to make of all of this. This is different kind of territory from our usual live on air discussing very sedate theological matters. But without any further ado, let's kick off by asking Peter, you've been both a Methodist minister and you've had a life career as a lawyer. What were the really interesting features for you when you practiced law?
I can't just start there. I've got to go back a bit because I came from a very privileged background. I was brought up in Waiake. I knew I was going to be a lawyer since I was a teenager. I became a lawyer. Andrea and I have been married for a long time now. We bought our own house with little difficulty early on. I was a commercial, or started off being in commercial law, and life could have been pretty peachy in society's eyes at that stage. But things changed. I went to Whakatane and became a litigation lawyer, and there in Whakatane had my meeting with Maori. Black Power was a gang that we used to drink with rather than were involved in drugs at that stage, and so it was a very different era, a very different place, and for this white person brought up in Waiake, encounter with Maori was something that was foreign, but became ordinary. We then came back to Auckland, and at that stage we adopted Anna, who is also Maori, and so being bicultural is not an option for me. Waiake never seemed to fit particularly well after that. I used to work in South Auckland as a lawyer eventually, and South Auckland is more like hometown. So all those things, I was a lawyer, and I'll come back to what was interesting about it in a minute, but as part of being a lawyer, I also had other jobs as well. I set up the youth advocacy, or helped set up the youth advocacy system in New Zealand before it got underway now many years ago. And so children and youth offenders have always been part of my being. When I worked for the Department of Social Welfare prosecuting child abusers, and so child abuse was part of my culture, but that's when I first went into supervision, and so I have been in supervision as a lawyer and as a minister for now a very long time,
and obviously found it valuable in both spheres
and necessary. Yeah. I then, after I was a lawyer, I worked for the Health and Disability Commissioner, and we'll hear a bit more about that. And I was also a probation officer. And so a whole bunch of things came together so that as a minister, there were some really, some things that were pulled together that were really good. And I'll come to that in a minute. But as a lawyer, about 3 or 4 things that I found really interesting. One of those is that hoary old question: if you know he's guilty, how could you on earth defend him? And I lived with that for many years as a criminal barrister. it's the same thing as, well, if you'd done nothing wrong, you wouldn't care if people had a camera on you. It's that same sort of attitude. Many people feel like that, but for those who do not feel like that, where that issue of freedom is such that it is so important that they would do anything to keep that freedom, that's the same thinking behind giving every person a good defence, to make sure that the police are honest, to make sure the judges are honest, to make sure that the system acts fairly.
I'm not going to put that question to you tonight.
The other thing, as I said before, I was one of the 10 participants in the youth advocacy system when it first grew up. There were some other famous people there, and we as lawyers together went the same day to the youth court with the same judge, the same social worker, the same police prosecutor, and often the same defendants. And each time this defendant offended, he came back into that same audience. He could never get away with saying, "This is my first time." And so that was one of the places where I enjoyed life. And it also led me to understand that there are some people who are evil. And that was an awesome understanding.
But it's equally the absolute necessity of the Christian message that to say that some people are evil is true, but to acknowledge that to some extent we're all flawed is even a greater truth.
And it is a realization that that's true of many more things in life as well. So that was an early learning for me as a lawyer. And the last thing I want to say about that is that entitlement is tempting. It was very easy to become, as a criminal barrister, expecting things to happen in the way that I wanted them to happen, and I was really the only driver of that. And it's really easy to try and move that into other areas of your life, and it's what I see many people in law do, and I think that that is one of the real mistakes of a professional person, is that they are often tempted to think that that's how life always is.
Do you think that's also true? It's anticipating, but is it true of ministry as well?
I think it can. I think it can be. Yeah.
How
was I involved with the church? Well, I've mostly always been involved with the church. My parents were Christian. My dad was a Christian activist in England, and he and his minister were extremely good friends. I grew up with their children as my friends. When I came to New Zealand, I was a sailor, and many of my friends were going to Bible class and so on. So naturally I went along to Bible class. It was a Baptist Bible class instead of the Anglican that I grew up as. And then I met Andrea. After I continued to go to church until the day we were married. We were married, and that was the last time I stepped in church for 7 years or so. After that time, Andrea, we had come back to Auckland from Whakatane that stage. We had children. Andrea became convinced that God was calling. And so we gravitated back to church and eventually to the Methodist Church. And after that, I have stayed as a regular member of the Methodist Church.
What have been the highlights of being a regular member of the Methodist Church? Because, I mean, you've moved beyond just being a church member to become an ordained minister. So, What convinced you that you should move from just being a member to a clergy?
It's interesting, isn't it? How can I talk about that journey in 47 seconds? I became convinced as a Christian that that Christ was near to me, and as a result of that conviction, a whole bunch of things changed. Over various things, we became the parents of the Bible class at Trinity. We had a Bible class of about 100 kids at that stage.
That's Trinity Pakuranga.
Pakuranga, yeah. And grew some fine young Christians who all turned into Wesleyans at that stage. We then, Telm, and that's one of the things I put in here that I mourn. Telm was a wonderful program that required people to think for themselves.
Now that's training and education for lay ministry,
right.
And it started at the Wellspring Centre, which was associated with Trinity Theological College.
And that convinced me to get my lay preacher's certificates and eventually into some theological education. And over a period of a number of years, I was convinced that my calling was to ordained ministry. My life work was felt like it was directed towards that. And so 17 years ago, about 19 years ago now, I was in college and have had 3 stationed appointments since. Mostly of real value. I have enjoyed my time as an ordained minister. I've learnt a lot, and I'm going to tell you a little about that in a few moments. But it has been a wonderful, wonderful journey through.
Is there a commonality between the law and the church insofar as both are concerned with people, often vulnerable people, often people that have some difficulties and in a sense need some help or a helping hand and some assistance? Is that a common theme between the two?
Well, they're obviously identifiable as such for me, and those themes of advocacy and vulnerable people and young people and all those things have come together. I was working for the Health and Disability Commissioner's office, and so became used to our health system, and in that way an advocate in that area, which continues today as well. So a whole group of things came together from my previous jobs and from my previous tasks within those jobs that fit together very nicely as an ordained minister, both here in Whangarei, where we were before, and in Christchurch before then.
When you're in the pulpit on a Sunday morning and giving your sermon or message, is that similar to being like in the courtroom and presenting information?
Persuasive and advocate, an advocating voice. No, not at all, David, actually. It is all too easy for a person to try to talk people into the kingdom of God. And I don't think that that's particularly helpful a way of asking people to accompany you on that journey with Christ. I believe that actually it's a much more invitational thing, and therefore advocacy doesn't so much come into that aspect of my task as an ordained minister. And I have to really, really try hard to make sure that that doesn't happen, because it's a natural outcome of who I am too.
Right.
That was one of the things, and a youth movement within the Trinity Church was something that, like here at Papakura, has grown slowly, but it grew slowly and didn't really stop. We started with, I think, around about 12 kids in our youth group, and it was the time when the Life and the Spirit seminars were about. The charismatic renewal was in full flow, and there were various aspects of evangelical workings around the churches, not just Trinity Pakuranga, but the whole of the churches. And so I was a gently warmed charismatic, and thought that Andrea and I were called to, well, I was part of the youth group leadership at that stage, and we started off, I think, with 3 leaders and 12 young people, and the church took the risky step of employing a full-time youth worker, and that youth worker did a great job in developing youth. I think it's a model that we find it difficult to use nowadays, and I think it's a shame. Every church has that sort of growth and decline, and we saw that in particular during the 1960s, when there were large numbers of people in church, and then suddenly, over a period of a very short time, that went from a large number to a small number, and people keep asking, well, how come it happened? Well, I think that was just natural, and I think it can just as naturally grow back up again.
Well, that's an optimistic point of view. I think there's some justification for saying that, because as far as I've been able to work out, part of the reason for growth in churches is usually around the enthusiasm of a committed group of people. It's the enthusiasm that people bring into the church for all kinds of projects that can have a gospel tinge to them.
Well, I think we've seen that with other churches that we're aware of. Places like Destiny. Destiny comes together as a large church for a good reason. I may not agree with their theology, and I may not agree with their practice, but what they do as church together is a good thing, and it is part of the way in which our Trinity youth group was grown, and it will be the way in which they will diminish, because it is dependent upon effectively one couple's work at that point.
Yeah, in some ways they don't fit Stephen Skewes' model of having enough collaborative, shared, participatory leadership.
Exactly.
And I think that's key to it. In a real sense, the Methodist Church used to have a slogan, every member a minister. Now, I didn't like the slogan, but I liked the idea every member had a ministry. Every member had a service that they could do for another.
Yep, and that's part of what Skewes is saying in his video very clearly, that each person needs a place to be.
Peter, that when you say a place to be, did you have a sense of struggle in finding your place to be as a Methodist minister as opposed to a Methodist layperson? Is it easier to be lay than it is to be ordained?
It's a very good question, David, and I think that fortunately for myself, both Whangarei and particularly in Papakura, the churches here have a particular style that suits my own style. I think churches, just like people, can be introvert and extrovert and all those other things as well. And in each case, the church has a personality that's a little more aligned to my own, and I find that easier to be an ordained minister in a church whose style is more immediately aligned to my own.
Well, I mean, that's got to be the case. I would find it very difficult to be the minister here at Crossroads Papakura, but I find it extremely easy to be the minister in a number of other settings. Now I'm retired, the big trick is to not be the minister. And that's actually much easier than it sounds. A retired presbyter can basically do what they want. They can perform their own every member has a ministry function without actually, doing all the official kinds of things that go on.
Yeah, but part of the task of being all those officially designed tasks is to make sure that you do what you do well, and make sure that the bits that you don't do well are gathered together by those who have a ministry to do those things well. One of the things here at Crossroads is that we have a commercial property arm. We own a very large amount of Papakura, and that is both a blessing and a curse on this church. A blessing from the wise foresight of our forebears, because it allows us to work without any money worries at all. A curse because it puts no pressure on us to do the work as Christians, because we always have the money behind us to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Now, that said, I come from a commercial law background, yet I find administrative tasks that the commercial property arm does neither fulfilling nor uplifting, and I have people that do those extremely well, and so I don't have to do those and won't. Gathering together a group of people around the minister, and it doesn't have to be just a minister. I've seen it work just as easily in a local shared ministry group, and even in a house church, where there are a group of people who are called to do the work that they are doing, rather than forced into doing work that has to be done, but they couldn't be bothered doing. That's the difference between enthusiasm and it will get done.
Okay, and Wesley was a great advocate for enthusiasm in Theos, the God that dwells within.
Yep. When I came to the face-to-face here at Papakura, we met here in the cafe, which you can't see at this stage, but it's a glass-covered area which faces directly out onto the sex shop across the road, and to the bong shop just across the road. And one of my tasks was to spend time here talking to people, to make them feel welcome here in this little area, where each person who comes in, whether they like it or not, is treated as a congregation member. They are us. And so it becomes a time where hospitality is practiced. But it's one of those things that this church did well in changing things, that it required some changes of the minister. And if the minister was not prepared to make those changes, they weren't prepared to have them. We face that same change now with all the new houses that have been built around us. What is it that makes us a church that only must have one minister at one building and blow the rest of it? It's the very issue that Wesley himself fought against in the Anglican Church. And I'm not yet prepared to stand on the gravestones, but somehow we must look at how do we connect with the community that has no idea that this is a church in the middle of town. And so I'd love to be able to talk more about the changes that we must make. It's a passion that I wish I had another 20 years for.
Perhaps you'd be willing to come back into another live on air, or get a few other people in where we're talking about, what kind of influence can we now have on a church that has a great deal of heart, a great deal of social conscience, but has yet to rediscover how to connect with people. I think that would be a fair summation of where Methodism, both in the UK and in New Zealand, is at. Peter, may I say thank you very much indeed for coming live on air with me this evening.
Thank you to the participants that we aren't able to see, but who are behind the computer screen, and we're very aware of their presence as well.